Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from many different time zones on this call. Thank you for being part of us and joining us for part one of the Atlantic Council's MENA Futures Lab three-part webinar series on GCC economies amid the Middle East, geopolitics, financial markets, and structural reform. My name is Khalid Azim. I'm the inaugural director of the MENA Futures Lab, and I'll be your host for today's session. Recent strikes and security incidents affecting parts of the region have underscored the vulnerability of critical infrastructure and energy systems, while also testing the capacity of governments to manage economic disruption. This first episode, called Fiscal Resilience and Macroeconomic Stability During the Iran War, will aim to examine the macroeconomic implications of the ongoing Middle East conflict for the economies of the GCC. To do so, I'm joined by three very prominent panelists. Dr. Riyad Safadi, Chief Economist at White Shield in Dubai. Dr. Dania Tafar, the Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum, an institute based in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Omar Al-Ubadi, a Senior Research at Deseret in Bahrain. Before we start, I'd like to mention that we'll be leaving a few minutes for audience questions. So if you have any questions, please feel to ask them throughout the event by going on askac.org. So let me start by kind of asking a question to all the panelists. I'd ask you to go, one by one to talk about to answer this question. The first question is, what are the main macroeconomic costs of this conflict for GCC economies? Dr. Omar, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much for having me today. Where do I start when it comes to the macroeconomic costs? There's many. Usually, when we talk about macroeconomics, we can think about things like the fiscal costs, the costs in terms of labor market challenges, the disruptions to international trade, and even more importantly, more fundamentally, the disruption to economic growth. There's an adverse impact on all of them, and I'm sure my colleagues will also have some input there. But I think it's important to start, given that it's 2026, it's 250 years since the publication of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And it is worth noting that in his Wealth of Nations, he spoke about how freedom from piracy, freedom from expropriation are fundamental precursors for economic activity and prosperity. I think the quote is something along the lines of, where men are continually afraid of violence, economic activity remains rudimentary and stagnant, something along those lines. And that really is the core fear, the very crude illustration of that, no pun intended, in the current crisis is the fact that they can't export a significant part of their key industries. We're talking about petroleum products, aluminium, and other metal products, because the Straits of Hormuz are de facto closed. And they also can't import significant volumes of the materials they need to operate their economies. And these will have significant adverse effects on their economies, on their growth, on their labor markets. And as you're all aware, out in Washington, D.C., these effects are not restricted to the GCC countries or even the ones in the region. This is something with profound consequences for the entire economy. I was reading in the newspaper this morning that the Philippines has commenced fuel rationing and is switching to remote work because it doesn't have the resources needed to operate its economy at full capacity. So that's just a quick flavor of the sort of disruption we have. It's going to be a tough road ahead.
Well, I'll come back to you. I'd like to kind of quantify a little of what you said and come back to some of your main points, but let me pass on to Dr. Dania. If you could kind of give me your perspective, please, on what you think the main macroeconomic costs are for this conflict for the GCC.
Thank you, Khalid, for having me here today. Well, I think it's important to highlight kind of where the risk factors lie in terms of affecting macroeconomic indicators. First and foremost, I think geography is going to play a huge role in this, by virtue of who's disrupted the most with the Strait of Hormuz blockage. because logistical factors are extremely important for macroeconomic indicators, especially when it comes to inflation, into disruption of their main revenue sources of hydrocarbons. So logistics is going to play a huge role. Some Gulf states are actually struggling more logistically speaking, especially some of the smaller Gulf states that are located within the Strait of Hormuz, such as Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. And the other risk factor I think to consider are financial buffers and fiscal buffers for the Gulf states, depending on how much each state has in terms of these buffers are really going to affect how well they can manage the situation if it continues for much longer. Some Gulf states have really high reserves and sovereign wealth funds, like Qatar, for example. Kuwait has a lot of wealth in terms of sovereign wealth funds and very low debt, and the UAE. Other countries might struggle a bit more in that regard. I think Bahrain will struggle the most, but also because of its location, because as I mentioned, the geography is going to play a role, but also Oman, if it continues, although Oman was really the country that was struck the least. I think debt ratios are going to play a factor. Some Gulf states have really high debt ratios, namely Bahrain, and very low debt ratios, namely Kuwait. But I think that's really for domestic political reasons, because for a long time, Kuwait could not actually tap into the debt markets. So I think these are factors that are going to affect macroeconomic indicators, along with the degree of strikes that the different countries experienced, and the interception rates, I think, could cause changes in terms of, employment, human capital, and investments.
Thank you. Dr. Riyad?
Right. So let me start with a positive note. The risks that my colleagues on the panel have outlined, they're here. There are clear risks. But this is a policy manageable shock if addressed early and through the right channels. So this is a multi-channel transmission shock, actually affecting trade, logistics, financial conditions, and demand simultaneously. The costs, let me be very specific, they emerge through a number of interlinked channels. Trade and logistics disruption, you have higher freight, insurance, and rerouting costs, and of course, slowing trade and rising transaction costs. Second, you have a tighter financial conditions with rising risk premia, more cautious bank lending, and of course, potential dollar liquidity pressures that may constrain credit expansion. There are also the input cost volatility with energy, food, intermediate goods prices are feeding into inflation and compressing margins. And of course, there is another channel, transmission channel, right? Confidence and investment delays, where you have uncertainty, slowing private investment and delaying project executions. What matters the most in how these channels actually interact. It is not a linear shock by any means. It is a system-wide transmission with reinforcing feedback loops across trade, finance, and expectation. So at the macro level, you ask about cost, unless they're countervailed with the right policy early and through the right channels. The costs are, slower non-oil growth, more persistent inflation, tighter fiscal space at the margin, weaker private credit expansion, and greater volatility in capital flows. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll come back. I can expand on any one of these points.
Well, that's a very thoughtful framing from all three of you. Thank you. So there's a comment about the invisible hand of Adam Smith. risk factors, and whether or not this is cross-border, cross-risk versus linear. But let me narrow down kind of on the opportunity cost. So on January 1st, 2026, the GDP forecasts as per the IMF are roughly for Bahrain was about 3%, Oman was 3.6%, so Saudi Arabia was 4.1%, Qatar was 4.3%, UAE was 4.4%, and Kuwait was 2.5%. So with that backdrop, can you help me think about what is the opportunity cost of this engagement? I know part of the answer is depending on how long it lasts, and I'm not asking you to look into a crystal ball, but give me a sense of what's been lost to date, and if this duration of this event continues for a protracted period of time, what will be the economic consequence for these economies? Dr.
Should I
Danya,
start?
please
Yeah,
go
Danya,
for it.
okay.
Go for it. Go. No, please start. Please start.
For me, again, I go back to the channels. So one of the first channel is the delayed investments. So firms will postpone or scale down projects as risk increases, and the longer that the events, endure, the more delays in the investments, right? The second important channel is the slower structural reform. So governments will shift from transformation projects and transformation focus into stabilization focus. And then, of course, the reallocation of the policy attention. So immediate risks, they will crowd out, in my view, long-term priorities. And these are the things. At the macro level, this will lead to, again, the lower potential growth, delayed diversification, weaker FDI inflows, and reduced innovation. These are the potential risks that may arise if not addressed properly and at the right time.
So, Dr. Danya, let me get the next question to you. So, with that context in mind, what do you think unemployment and inflation looks like? What do you think the consequences to date have been to the real economy, and how is it flowing through into these nation states?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of unemployment, it really depends on how long this lasts, and also it varies between Gulf state to Gulf state. So as we know, the Gulf economies are highly based on, many of them, on expatriate human capital. And I think that could have an effect if this continues in the long term, that they leave. But at this point, I would say from anecdotal discussions and whatnot, like for example, here in Qatar, most people are feeling confident enough to stay within the Gulf states with the degree of interception rates and hoping that this war would end soon. In terms of employment, of course, if you think about what industries were affected, that of course would affect the employment in those industries. The aviation industry is a major one for, especially for Qatar, especially for the United Arab Emirates. This industry could take a hit depending on how long this lasts. Tourism and hotels, the hospitality industry could take a hit, and that could affect varying degrees of employment. And so it can affect to different degrees. Now, in terms of inflation, it depends on many things. And what type of inflation are you looking at? Like, for example, everyday goods can be affected, especially for the states that were affected by the Strait of Hormuz, notably the smaller Gulf states, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. But also you have to think about, one, the food stockpile reserves that exist in the Gulf countries to be able to weather this. And I think most Gulf states have 6 months, and some have said above 6 months worth of food stockpiles. On top of that, Gulf states generally have a tendency to subsidize, for example, costs of inflation. They could do that probably in the short term in the wealthier Gulf states to offset inflation, but no doubt it's going to have an effect, especially in terms of increased logistical costs, insurance costs, rerouting So we can look at inflation. I've seen estimates, for example, from the IMF, depending on which country, from 1 to 3% levels of inflation.
On that inflation question, if the war were to stop today, this minute, what follow through inflationary pressures would you see in these economies?
Well, for me, it would. Sorry, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Thank you. I still have not witnessed a high degree of inflation as of yet, but of course, the disruption and the rerouting will still have effect for, I think, the short term, at least, in inflation. And I've read, for example, the UAE has warned that they do not want costs to rise, and has been monitoring that. So I think the Gulf states will react differently to it and try to hedge against it. But it is still a risk factor in the short term because of the disruption, and the rerouting is going to take a lot of time. To get energy sources back online is going to take time. So it's certainly a concern.
Well, I'll get back to monetary policy on this point in a bit, but Dr. Omar, I want to get back to you. Since you brought up Adam Smith, I want to deal with more of a neoclassical question. The neoclassical outlook for economic, productivity is the combination of labor plus capital plus land. And so in that context, what do you think the opportunity costs will be for these economies? How much will they contract? If the GDP growth outlook, like I ran through the numbers, are between 2.5 and 4.3% on January 1st, what do you think they'll be on December 31st of this year?
I think if we take if we make an assumption that this isn't going to last more than a few months, then I think that what you saw in COVID is that even when you have a deep crisis, as long as the crisis is transient, then a lot of what you lose, you can make up in the time afterwards. The risk for the Gulf countries is not so much the opportunity cost in terms of what they can't do at the moment that they will be able to do later. It's more in the long run in terms of the big reallocation of resources that's going to have to happen to things like security, to new logistical arrangements, to fortifying their existing supply chains. That is going to be a much bigger opportunity cost, 5-10 years from now, looking back, than the disruption, the transient disruption that we're witnessing at present. So just to give an example, the Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline, which has been leveraging to transport oil from the eastern province to Jeddah to export therein. UAE has its pipeline to Fujairah. These things will probably be upgraded, fortified, and these require massive investments. A country like Kuwait, a country like Qatar, a country like Bahrain will have to come up with new ways to reach the markets that do not involve the Straits of Hormuz, and that will involve big outlays. In the long run, these are going to dwarf the transient impacts that you're alluding to when you're talking about declines in headline growth rates or increases in inflation. And that really is where the Gulf countries are going to have to be much more judicious and much more circumspect in terms of how to allocate their scarce resources. They're undergoing economic transformations under the banners of their economic visions. And that means that, they need capital. And now, a significant part of that capital is going to have to be reallocated towards these new, more secure production methods. You mentioned the neoclassical production function. That production function actually, again, is based on the assumption that there's no pirates, there's no coercive actors. So we've got to go step back, build that up again, and then hopefully things can head in the right direction.
Great. Well, thank you. Dr. Riyad, let me go back to you and talk about SMEs and small and medium enterprises, the role they play in the economy and their importance in job creation, and what in what context do you how are they going to be impacted, and how will they need to be supported by the GCC economies?
Excellent. The SME outlook, if you will, right? It must be understood within through the macroeconomic environment that we just spoke about, right? So the slower growth and, the high inflation. And by the way, inflation in here is supply driven, not demand driven, and of course, the employment in here is domestic employment, right? So the inflation is externally anchored. Employment is domestically anchored. And these forces and their impact on the macro level, will have a direct impact on the SME sector, small, medium enterprise sectors. So three forces will define it, actually. Persistent cost and trade pressures, the tighter and more selective credit, and this is a critical element, and the moderating non-oil growth, no matter how you calculate it, going from 4.4% to 4%. It all depends on a couple of things, the duration certainly, and the policy tools and the policy measures that each governments will put out immediately and appropriately targeted and timeliness, right? So if you look at the SMEs, their major their economic weight is pretty decisive in here. Between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, they represent more than 90% of firms, right? And their contribution to employment is above 80%, except maybe for Qatar is about 60% of private employment, right? Their contribution to GDP in the UAE is about 63%. In Saudi Arabia, it's close to 30%. And in Qatar, 20 to 25%. So their role, economic role is decisive, weight is decisive, right? So you have, if you look at them, you have what you call a three-stage financial stress dynamic that will affect them. First is the liquidity pressure that we looked, just identified, right? Then the margin compression, and ultimately, God forbids, the insolvency rises, right? So you have cash flow compression, payment delays, inventory disruptions, rising working capital needs, higher financing costs. All of them may lead to a liquidity shock, although importantly, it is a liquidity shock, not a production shock. So policy can come in here, to hold these forces at bay.
So there's going to be a fiscal component to supporting SMEs, correct?
Listen, the monetary policy, why I talked about inflation and what have you, right? The monetary policy in here cannot do the heavy lifting. There is, okay. It's very clear, right? So inflation is external.
Well, we'll come back to the monetary policy, but Dr. Dania, I know you're a political economist, and I'd kind of really like to talk about fiscal policy for the moment right now, in particular, to build on the comments about the support that the real economy and SMEs will need to sustain economic, vitality in these economies. But, to put a baseline on this again, just to tell you what the fiscal deficit outlook was on January 1st of this year, Bahrain had a fiscal balance of negative 5.8% of GDP. Oman was basically flat at zero. Saudi Arabia had about a 4% fiscal deficit as a percent of GDP. Qatar was about flat at zero. UAE had a surplus at 3.7%, and Kuwait had a surplus at 3.4%. So my question to you is on fiscal policy is, how much, how expansionary will fiscal policy have to be? Number one. And number two is, how are those fiscal balances going to be financed within these economies?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think it depends. Like as I started from the beginning of this presentation, I said there were different risk factors for every Gulf state, and one consideration is their fiscal buffers. And depending on the Gulf states, degree of fiscal buffers is a way at which to see how long the Gulf states can actually wait out this war and maintain its financial status close to where it is, not where it is. In terms of Gulf states have a substantial amount of sovereign wealth fund wealth. We say 40% of the global sovereign wealth funds are based in the Gulf states. The wealthier states in terms of sovereign wealth funds are Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Now, I will have to say all the Gulf states have not been hit equally in terms of hydrocarbon disruptions. For example, Saudi Arabia is still selling oil, even though at a much lower rate than before, but also it's offset with much higher oil prices than before. Therefore, it hasn't hit Saudi as hard as, for example, Qatar, in terms of not being able to sell its gas, and with the Ras Laffan hit that happened in Qatar. So in terms of their ability to weather this, I think Qatar has a lot of reserves, financial reserves, and I think it's about 70 billion in financial reserves. Therefore, they still are able to offset the war effects for the next few months. And I think also Saudi Arabia has been tapping into the debt market, but this was planned tapping. It was not a reaction to this war, particularly speaking. So it has taken out debt in March 10th. So there are many options. They have not yet, from my understanding, withdrawn from their sovereign wealth funds at this point. But again, like I mentioned before, the countries that are higher risk from a financial buffer perspective is going to be Bahrain. You mentioned Bahrain's debt ratio is very high. I think if I remember correctly, it's about 140% of its GDP. And therefore, I think Bahrain might rely on the other Gulf states, as it has before when there were financial crises in Bahrain, to assist it during the crisis. So there are in different situations right now. It's not urgent. Right now, they're not tapping into the debt markets. So they have a high degree of ability to weather this if this lasts maybe for a month or so. But things could change as the war continues on beyond, let's say, the end of April.
Dr. Omar, let's build on that, and I'd like you to talk to us about what roles the sovereign wealth funds should play. How can they play a role, and in what manner will they play that role? Can you help us think about that in terms of the fiscal deficits, which are going to need to be financed as these economies go into more expansionary fiscal policies?
Just building on what Dr. Dania said, there is some significant heterogeneity in the Gulf regarding in this case, the sovereign wealth funds. In some cases, like Qatar or Kuwait, these are designed primarily as methods to diversify the economy by investing externally and shielding the economy from the ups and downs that would be caused by oil prices, or in this case, some sort of disruptive violent conflict. In other cases, like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, the sovereign wealth fund has a significant role in growing the domestic economy through strategic investments, which are designed to develop, to incubate, startups, or to help, medium-sized enterprises reach something much bigger. Or even in the case of Saudi Arabia, to attract, to initiate new sectors like sports or entertainment. In both cases, the liquidity side, as Dr. Ahmed mentioned, of the current crisis is something that is best addressed by monetary authorities in the initial phase, and then further on through fiscal policy, through fiscal stimulus, through the government taking out loans, hopefully at reasonable rates, in order to keep these kind of businesses afloat and to address these kind of issues. The sovereign wealth funds are not really designed for dealing with what we're facing at the moment. And although they could perform some sort of emergency duty if necessary, it is unlikely that they would be called upon to do that. The monetary authorities, the fiscal authorities, and the instruments that exist in all 6 countries are quite advanced, and they have plenty of experience using them, dating back to at least 2008 from the global financial crisis, and then subsequently in the oil crisis of 2014, and then in the COVID 2020. So in answer to your question, I don't think the sovereign wealth funds will be used in any significant capacity. More, if they do make an intervention, it will be more likely in countries like Saudi Arabia, where they have a more prominent role in growing the domestic economy. But in a country like Qatar or Kuwait, where these things exist primarily as vehicles for diversifying the economy, I imagine that it will continue in this largely silent role, with the possible exception of greater distribution of dividends or greater use of dividends as liquid income, in the near term, rather than reinvesting them as would normally be done under peaceful circumstances.
So let me peel that back a little bit. Do you think, so let's assume the sovereign wealth funds do not play that role the way you articulate, the deficit will grow, and the allocation of those of that spending will go where? What sectors? How will the GCC countries look to allocate that those expansionary policies back into the real economy to stimulate economic activity?
So the governments will use a mixture of domestic and international debt issues. I think Dr. Dani mentioned Saudi Arabia already had pre-existing expansive debt issue plans. So usually it'll be just a case of regular government bonds secured through sovereign debt markets, under with credit ratings from Moody's and so on and so forth. Maybe on certain occasions there'll be like specific projects where there'll be equity rather than debt as the source of the liquidity. But for the most part, although the debt to GDP ratio varies quite significantly within the GCC, all of them have some breathing room, and probably that's where the debt will go. And what makes it makes it more likely that that's going to be the case rather than any sort of drastic or non-linear action, is that although at the moment it doesn't seem that way, it does look like this crisis is one that is transient, and it's not something that's going to be going on for years and years and years. And certainly not as long as something like COVID. Famous last words, but that's really the impression. So I think, yes, in answer to your question, just boring boilerplate debt issues in sovereign markets.
So I think it's a good segue to monetary policy, and I'd like each of you to answer this question. So, given the dollar peg of GCC currencies, what are the implications for monetary policies to stimulate economic growth and activity? Dr. Omar, why don't you start, since you have the mic right now?
Could you repeat that last part? Sorry.
It's a monetary policy, the dollar pegs. So how will they use monetary policy to stimulate economic activity?
So, I mean, we can go back to the previous crises. First of all, the dollar peg is something that's very important for the stability of the economies. You asked about inflation. One of the reasons we've had low inflation for 30, 40 years in the Gulf, whatever the circumstances, is that we have that dollar peg, and it is in our incentives to maintain those dollar pegs. Although obviously Kuwait has a slightly different situation, where it has a basket. It's pegged against the basket of currencies, with the dollar is the biggest one, but for all intents and purposes, it's a peg. So I don't envisage any revision to the policy of the peg. In fact, that's a cornerstone of the strength of these economies. What I will expect they will do is, first of all, some emergency measures, going back to what Dr. I mentioned in the case of SMEs. So maybe some emergency credit extension to SMEs, to industries or companies that are in distress, in a way that is transient and which are fundamentally viable once the crisis ends. and they just need something to get them over the hump, they may extend some credit. So in Bahrain, for example, one of the things we saw during COVID at the household level was a deferment on loan repayments. And then, some sort of commercial or analog to that is something that will plausibly happen. And then also relaxation of, requirements or, Basel III style requirements that are usually imposed upon banks in order to make their balance sheets a little bit looser so that they can keep, I imagine, some, zero interest lending from the central bank to financial institutions. So very much straight out of the COVID playbook. Although maybe compressed and not as expansive as before, not as expansive as we saw under 2008.
Dr. Riyad, do you have a view on the monetary policy prescriptions ahead for the GCC countries?
Yeah. Let me add to what we just heard, right? I mean, it really actually anchors on the plus side, right? It anchors inflation expectations, it stabilizes capital flows, and it supports financial confidence, right? That's on the positive side. The constraints are, from a PEG system is that it will import tight monetary conditions. It will limit domestic credit easing. And because of these constraints, actually, I said earlier that monetary policy cannot do the heavy lifting in the current situation. This is why I put the onus on the fiscal policy. And in the fiscal policy front, we talked about each country's ability to respond and what have you. For me, it's not actually the ability; it's the timeliness, the targeting, right, and the coordination across all these channels that we spoke about, right? Coordination of policies all across. And here, I go back to also what I just said earlier on the SME front, that are the backbone of the economies across the GCCs.
So let me kind of build on your point about, going back to fiscal policy with Dr. Dania and talk about, political will. Government's going to have to make, some difficult choices. And could you give us a sense as to, what are the challenges and opportunities that will be available to these countries in terms of political will to make these difficult choices?
Yeah, just one point I want to make about the currency peg is that the problem is the US economy is on a completely different page, and the Gulf state economies are in a war situation. And so if the US was to apply certain policies that could cause an increase in inflation here in the Gulf states, that's the problem when the Gulf states currencies are pegged to the US. And so I think this is what arises during this war. And it could, US policy can easily cause a hike in inflation in already a situation where there's logistical disruptions. In terms of your other question about the political situation, over the last couple of years, the Gulf states have really centralized power over decision-making over the countries. Like, for example, in Kuwait now, there's not a parliament there to kind of challenge and try to force legislation against what the government wants to pass forward when it comes to economic reform in the Gulf states. So I think this centralization does make a difference in terms of reform capacity for the Gulf states. Of course, it varies from Gulf state to Gulf state. For example, Kuwait's political economy is heavily controlled by business elites, and they have a lot of influence in the private sector, whereas, for example, in Qatar, you don't have that weight. SOEs are really the main players in those economies. So it's much easier, I think, in the case of Qatar, to reform very quickly. And it's shown that previously during, the Gulf crisis or the stock market crisis in the Gulf. historically speaking. So I think it depends on how centralized power is. Other issues is how the Gulf states are handling, the messaging of this war, and in terms of engaging with the populations. I've seen throughout the Gulf states many videos about, what to understand what's happening, making sure that there's no misinformation about, the financial capacity of the banks or withdrawing money. And so I think, politically speaking, I don't see a high risk factor from the perspective of the Gulf states. I think the most prominent risk factor is probably what would happen with the expatriates if this war continues. It seems like President Trump is looking for an off-ramp and looking for a deal. Yeah, at the same time, he's sending Marines here. But it could be here as into the Gulf, not to Qatar, more towards Iran. So I don't want to cause any confusion, because there's been a big debate about troops in the region. So I don't see any political risks in terms of their engagement with their populations, but a risk of expatriates leaving, perhaps, and leaving behind items or loans that they didn't pay off. Those are all risk factors.
Yeah, I'll remind the audience that we're at the point where we're happy to take questions from the audience. Just submit a question through askac.org, and we'd be happy to put your question in. Dr. Omar, in the meantime, we're talking about, since we brought up the question of credit quality and the banking system, presumably, credit quality will deteriorate, at least somewhat, within the banking sector. What concerns do you have, if any, about the bank's ability to absorb those losses? And could you tell us a little bit about how well capitalized these banks are to deal with any kind of financial stress caused by a shrinking economy?
In the post-2008 world, and especially in the post-COVID world, these banks are generally very well capitalized. And the Gulf countries operate, very conservative and risk-averse financial systems, where the banks are ready for this kind of, well, not this kind of thing, but certainly for disruptions to daily business. So I don't foresee, as long as this crisis, is resolved in the next, within the coming period, I don't see any systemic, issues for the banking system. What will happen is, going back to the SMEs issue, is, performing loans will become non-performing loans because of, COVID-style disruption, whether it's people not being able to go out and enjoy themselves, or people not being able to travel, or people not being able to, participate in entertainment and tourism activities. These kind of sectors that are heavily affected will obviously have, liquidity problems, but they can be solved by, intelligent government interventions and targeted, monetary assistance, and it just requires that the government get ahead of these things and have a good register for what's going on. And in the long run, I don't foresee that posing a significant challenge. So overall, the monetary side is not the side that that is the greater concern. As long as this thing does wind down within a reasonable time frame. The bigger concern, as I say, is more what is the post crisis world look like economically, and what are the costs of doing business going to be like for the average company, the average bank, the average citizen in the region, in light of these coercive threats.
So to build on that, are you concerned about any financial contagion? So if there are credit quality problems, the banks are well capitalized; they can absorb those losses. But these economies are very interlinked, particularly within the GCC and with the rest of the world. Do you have any concerns about cross-contamination or financial contagion, which could trigger a broader kind of macro sell-off in the markets?
No, I don't think that the contagion through monetary systems or through international finance system is not a risk, again, because this is something transient, and this is not a financial shock. This is a real shock, a real supply side shock. However, the way it could metastasize into a global financial crisis, and actually it already is metastasizing into that, is if there's a prolonged chronic supply chain problem in terms of energy, in terms of electricity, in terms into a food problem with the petrochemicals, with things like fertilizer, urea, and so on and so forth. So if that happens, then this a fundamentally real supply side shock could transform into a financial shock that affects the old world. But the contagion channel will still primarily be real and through supply chain linkages rather than through sort of speculation or liquidity crunches.
Okay, I'm getting some questions in from our participants. So, Dr. Riyad, the question is to you. Within SMEs, which sectors rebound quickly and which face a long recovery? You're on mute. Sorry, would you?
Sorry. At the sectoral level, right? I mean, within the SME, right? All those engaged in domestic activities, right, will face certain challenges versus those that are engaged in external activities, right? The import-export business, they face different problems. Those who are servicing the domestic market, will see a demand reduction, right? And therefore, they will be, it's not that they're a priority sector or less priority sector. It's the kind of interventions that will prevent any of these SMEs to go from to go into insolvency, right? The policy interventions, once you think about them, you have to protect their liquidity. So accelerate payments, they extend guarantees, strengthen trade finance. You have to also look at the policies that will contain cost pressures, right? The temporary logistics and insurance support, utility flexibility, rental flexibility, targeted wage support, labor flexibility. Now, if I were to think about a priority, right? I look at those SMEs, and I'm not directing any government policy here, if you will, right? I look at those strategic SMEs, those that are engaged, for example, in the transformation, right? From oil to non-oil economy, right? The innovation, the creativity, the digital, that they are the 21st century SMEs rather than just your nuts and bolts SMEs. I'm not talking about barber shops or grocery shops. They will always be in operation in here. I'm talking about strategic SME sectors where you see their contribution to the transformation plan, right? And you prioritize them within a certain support package that starts, as I say, with a protection of liquidity and ensuring that they don't go from liquidity squeeze into insolvency.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question from the audience. How does the dollar peg help or constrain policymakers in this environment? Anyone want to take that one? Go ahead.
So, I mean, the dollar peg is almost certainly a source of support because first of all, on the liquidity side, if as is expected, the Gulf countries seek to secure credit from international sources, then a huge amount of the confidence that the foreign investors have in the Gulf, which contributes to lower interest rates, comes from the existence of that dollar peg. Secondly, the dollar peg more generally, when it comes to the rebuilding phase, and we're talking about significant damage to infrastructure, to oil and energy facilities, when foreign investors are invited to contribute to the upgrades and those rebuilding and upgrades, again, they will draw confidence in the existence of the peg. And then thirdly, when it comes to the question that Dr. Dania responded to earlier regarding inflation, this is something that's going to help inflation stay low, as you're seeing in several other countries, conflict countries in the region, including Iran, for example, which don't have a peg. When confidence starts to unravel, that can lead to galloping inflation. And one of the key defenses that the Gulf countries have against that sort of galloping inflation is the tying to the only downside is the one that Dr. Dania mentioned, which is that your monetary policy is now primarily in the hands of, but primarily follows what happens in the US, and the US is in a different point in the cycle. But overall, that's something of secondary or tertiary importance compared to the benefits that I mentioned.
Okay, I'll take one more question from the audience, and I'll start with my wrap-up questions. And the question is, any immediate implications on how the GCC should consider reallocating funding to its diversification programs at this point? Dr. Dania, you want to take that one?
Sure. There hasn't been any announcements about how they're rerouting their funding in terms of diversification, because right now they're rerouting funding towards security needs, especially in terms of buying weaponry that they need. They've just spent billions of dollars in the US purchasing emergency military equipment, and also soliciting missile defense systems globally, like the UAE, soliciting from South Korea, and also looking at purchasing some weapons to counter Iranian drones from Ukraine. And therefore, I think right now, the immediate concern is spending for defense purposes. I can imagine that, some of the large, it depends also how long this lasts. If this lasts less than a month, which I think many analysts are expecting to happen, and I think it really depends on Iran feeling that it established some kind of deterrence at this point, that this wouldn't happen again. So I think that it depends how long this lasts, but really, I think instead of spending money on these big mega projects, I think they might hold back a little bit on those spendings for the short term. Again, I think we're not at a breaking point at this point where it's going to be a major shift in spending for diversification, at least in the short term.
Dr. Omar, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add to, I agree with what Dania said, but I just want to add that, the fundamental pillar of the diversification strategies in the Gulf countries have is that, long-term dependence on hydrocarbons is not strategically viable. And that was true before the crisis, and the crisis has actually made that even truer, if possible. So I think that one of the areas we'll be looking for after they, go past the stage that Dr. Dania mentioned, is that they'll be looking for greater economic integration with the contiguous neighbors, or nearby neighbors that do not rely on the Straits of Hormuz or Bab el-Mandeb. So we're talking about Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, and they'll be looking to develop terrestrial exports to these countries, because to reduce the Egypt, of course, as well, to reduce the sensitivity or exposure to potential disruptions in Bab el-Mandeb and the Straits of Hormuz. So trade northward and eastward trade away from both straits will be a diversification priority in the long run, in addition to, obviously, the kind of service trade that doesn't require physical transportation. So, whether it's, developing software capabilities, knowledge, the ultimate knowledge economy goals that they have in the long run, intangible goods that can be delivered remotely here. If you live in the Gulf during Ramadan, we've all been watching a lot of entertainment on Shahid, which is like part of the Saudi Arabia's media empire. And we probably see more investment in that because obviously you can keep exporting media even if you happen to have the straits closed. So maybe more intangible investments in that kind.
Dr. Riyad, you wanted to jump in this question too?
No, just very quickly, right? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see, attention and expenditures move away a little bit from diversification and into stabilization, right? I mean, aside from the security issues, right? Now, today, what we need is a stabilization package, that requires fiscal support, across, many sectors, including the SMEs, right? So there will be delayed there, I wouldn't be surprised. And this is to be expected, right? We need now a stabilization package across the GCC economies.
So we have about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to just give a closing question and try to stay within these 4 minutes. And the question is, why should we be optimistic, or how should we be optimistic about the region, about its macroeconomic, trajectory? If we could close with something optimistic, that would be great. Dr. Danya, you want to start?
Yes. Well, there's a lot of optimism. I think the fact that all of the Gulf states faced this threat perception at the same time, not necessarily to the same degree, but at the same time, is a uniting factor. The fact that some states are locked into the Strait of Hormuz and are working with, for example, Saudi Arabia to get goods through Saudi Arabia creates more codependency between the Gulf states. I've also been following the engagement between the people-to-people engagement in the Gulf. It's after having a rough era during the Arab Spring and the Gulf crisis and all of that, I could see a more united rhetoric and front and engagement together. So there are definitely positives coming out of this. In terms of economic positives, of course, the codependencies, economically speaking, especially for the Gulf states that are within the Strait of Hormuz, it's a positive, I think, for collaborating with Saudi Arabia. I don't know how much of it is a positive to be within the Strait of Hormuz. And I just want to mention, I don't know if I should say a negative, but the Houthi factor, if they come in and block Bab el-Mandeb or disrupt it, that could be a major problem for some of these positives, but we haven't seen that yet, and hopefully we will not see that.
Well, 2 positives equals a negative. So, Dr. Omar, I'll pass it on to you.
Very briefly, you're a student of the region. I'm sure you're well aware that the region is no stranger to crises, whether we're talking about the Gulf or the Middle East. So the first source of optimism is that if you just look at the number of crises the region has faced in the last 30, 40 years, and despite those crises, it still comes out doing well. A particular salient example is the very deep financial crisis that they faced in 2008, 2009, and 5, 6, 7 years later, you would never know it would happen. That doesn't mean that things will correct themselves automatically, but it does mean that we have a lot of faith that once these societies put their minds together, they'll come up with something that puts them in a better stead. And I would also add to that when it comes to there's a lot of fear that international investors were not going to come back to the region. A sort of more negative positive, if I can phrase it that way, is that if you're an international investor and you were happy about the Gulf and now you're maybe cautious, the reality is that there's nowhere really in the world at the moment that's particularly attractive. Unfortunately, war and instability has become the norm in almost every region. And what the Gulf countries have going for them, and they will still have going for them after this, is that they're countries that respect property rights, that adhere to the rule of law in the commercial domain, and they're countries that pursue foreign policies that promote regional and global stability. And those things will persist after the crisis, and hopefully they will provide the groundwork for a prosperous economy.
Dr. Riyad, I'll give you the last remarks.
The last. Nothing like a crisis focuses the mind, right? So this is a golden opportunity to actually move forward on the economic integration across the GCC, right? This crisis, shows what within any one country, right? The policy levers across all the sectors, all the monetary, fiscal, competition, you name it, right? Trade, all of them, they need to be coordinated within a country and within a region, especially that is facing, exactly symmetrical risks and challenges. There is no substitute for a deepening regional economic integration across the GCC. And that's it for me, a very positive note to close on.
That's a wonderful way to end the conversation. I hope everyone on this call enjoyed this session and found it insightful. I certainly did. And I want to thank our three prominent speakers for their intellect, their time, and their energy, and their willingness to be part of this. If you're interested in the second part of our virtual events series, it'll be on more of a financial aspect. Please stay tuned. That event will be in about 2 weeks. And then we'll follow up with our third webcast, which will be looking more at the future of the region. You can find more about our MENA Futures Lab on the Atlantic Council website or by reaching out. Once again, thank you for your interest, and we look forward to having you with us next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.